I sat across from my sister-in-law-to-be's parents at the rehearsal dinner, watching my mother dab her napkin at the corner of her mouth like she was on camera. "This is our older daughter," she said, gesturing at me with two fingers like she was pointing out a stain. "She does in-home cleaning. Keeps her busy." My father laughed into his scotch. We stopped expecting much a long time ago. The table went quiet except for the clink of someone's fork. The groom's father, a silver-haired man who'd built half the office towers in downtown Dallas, set down his glass and looked at me a beat too long. "Wait," he said slowly. "Aren't you the one who—" I shook my head, just barely, just enough. He stopped mid-sentence and something shifted behind his eyes, the kind of recalculation you do when you realize you've misjudged a room. "My name's Ms. Hannah and I'm 36. For 11 years, I let my own family believe I scrubbed toilets for a living, while I quietly built a property management company that now oversees more square footage than half the commercial real estate in North Texas. Before I tell you how we ended up at that table, you need to understand how my family operates, because none of this makes sense without it. I grew up outside Dallas in a house that always looked perfect from the street and never quite was on the inside. My parents, Carol and Walter, cared about exactly one thing: what the neighbors thought. We went to the right church, drove leased cars we couldn't afford, and smiled for the holiday card every December like nothing was wrong. My younger sister, Paige, was 4 years behind me, and from the moment she could walk, she was the one they pointed cameras at. She did pageants, she did cheer, she got the bedroom with the bay window. I got the one next to the laundry room. When I was 20, halfway through my junior year at SMU, my parents pulled the plug on my tuition account without telling me. I found out when the bursar's office called asking why my payment had bounced. It took me 3 days of arguing with my mother to learn the truth. They'd used my education fund, money my grandmother had set aside specifically for me, to cover Paige's spring semester at a fashion school in Manhattan, plus a deposit on an apartment she needed to be taken seriously in the industry. When I confronted my mother, she didn't even flinch. "Family helps family," she said. "You're resourceful, you'll figure something out. Paige needs this more." I asked what exactly made Paige need a New York apartment more than I needed my last 2 years of college. My mother told me I was being selfish and that resentment wasn't a good look on me. I didn't have it in me to keep fighting a war I was clearly never going to win. I packed 2 duffel bags, moved into a basement apartment near Lower Greenville with a girl I barely knew from a campus job board, and dropped out for a semester to figure out how to eat. I started cleaning houses because a woman in my apartment building needed help twice a week and paid cash. Within a year, I had 11 regular clients. Within 3, I had a small crew and a beat-up Honda with magnetic signs on the doors that said Clearline Home Services. My parents told everyone exactly what you'd expect. At every birthday, every Thanksgiving, every random run-in at the grocery store, the story was the same. "Hannah cleans houses. We're not sure what happened with her. We just hope she's happy." They said it with this specific tone, equal parts pity and relief, like my failure proved something they needed proven, that the family hierarchy made sense after all. They never asked to see my apartment. They never asked who my clients were. If they had, they might have noticed that by year 5, my cleaning company was managing maintenance contracts for 4 apartment complexes, and that I'd quietly incorporated as Larkfield Property Group, and that the woman scrubbing baseboards in their imagination hadn't actually held a mop in 6 years. I let them believe it because the truth had stopped feeling like something they deserved. Every time I thought about correcting them, I remembered my mother's voice telling me I was being selfish over my own tuition money, and the urge would go cold in my chest. So I let it stand. I built quietly. I bought my first commercial property at 28, a strip mall off Greenville Avenue that nobody wanted because the anchor tenant had just closed. I filled it in 14 months and sold it for triple what I paid. By 32, I had a portfolio that made my accountant whistle the first time she saw the consolidated statement. I told my family none of it. When they asked what I was up to, I said, "Oh, you know, cleaning, keeping busy," and they nodded like that confirmed everything they already believed. Paige, meanwhile, never quite landed anywhere. The fashion career fizzled after 18 months when the company folded. She came home, tried real estate licensing, let that lapse, tried an online boutique that lasted 1 Christmas season. Through every failed attempt, my parents footed the bill and called it an investment in her future. When she met Derek at a wedding in Aspen 2 years ago, I watched my mother light up like Paige had finally produced the one achievement that mattered, landing a man whose family had actual old, quiet money. Derek's father, Walter Hargrove. Yes, my father's name too, which made the dinner table conversations unbearably confusing, ran a commercial development firm that, as it turned out, I had done business with twice without either of us realizing the families would ever intersect. The engagement happened fast. 6 months from the proposal to a wedding date, which my mother treated as a logistics emergency worthy of a war room. She started calling me with requests almost immediately, and I want to be clear about the texture of those calls because it tells you everything. She didn't call to include me. She called because she'd already decided what I owed. The first call came in March. "Hannah, honey, I know you're busy with your little business, but the venue needs a deep clean before the walkthrough, and I told them my daughter does this professionally. It'll save us so much money." I drove out there myself on a Saturday because some old reflex in me still flinched at disappointing her, and I spent 4 hours scrubbing grout in a barn venue outside Frisco while my mother sipped champagne with the wedding planner 40 feet away and never once offered me water. The second call was about money. Paige needed $3,000 for a bridesmaid coordination fee, which I later learned was code for a dress she'd put on a credit card and needed covered before the statement came due. My mother framed it as a loan. I sent it. I told myself it was the last one. It wasn't. The third call was the one that finally cracked something open in me. It was a Tuesday night in September, 6 weeks before the wedding, and my mother called, sounding rattled in a way I hadn't heard before. Someone had opened a credit line in Paige's name, she said, $4,000 at a furniture store, and Paige swore she hadn't done it. My mother wanted me to call the credit bureau and dispute it because, in her words, "You're better with this paperwork stuff than we are." I asked the obvious question: if someone stole Paige's identity, why was my mother asking me for my social security number 2 weeks later to double-check something with the wedding insurance? She got flustered and changed the subject. I let it go at the time. I didn't let it go in my head. I started paying closer attention after that, the way you do when a low hum finally gets loud enough to notice. I found out, through a cousin who still talked to me, that Paige had been the one who opened that furniture account, using a slightly altered version of her own information to dodge a collections flag on an older unpaid balance. The fraud story had been staged for my mother's benefit, or possibly my mother had staged it for mine, to soften me up before the social security number request. I never figured out exactly whose idea it was, and honestly, by then, it didn't matter. What mattered was that I was being worked, the way you work a mark, and that the people doing it were my own parents. The wedding venue was the part that still makes my jaw tighten when I think about it. 3 weeks out, my mother called to say the property management company for the venue, an old converted train depot outside McKinney, had emailed about a maintenance dispute that could delay the final walkthrough. She wanted to know if I had any contacts in commercial cleaning who could smooth it over as a favor. I told her I'd look into it. What I didn't tell her was that Larkfield Property Group had acquired the management contract for that exact depot 8 months earlier, after the previous management company lost it for chronic underperformance. I was, as it turned out, the contact. I'd been the contact the whole time. I sat on that information for 3 weeks. I want to be honest about why. Part of it was strategy, the same instinct that's made me good at negotiating commercial leases. Never reveal your position before you understand the whole board. But part of it, the bigger part if I'm honest, was that I wanted to watch a little longer. I wanted to see how far they'd go while they still believed I had nothing. They went pretty far. 10 days before the wedding, my mother called to ask if I could help out with the final catering balance, just until Derek's family's deposit cleared, since apparently there'd been a timing issue. The number she named was $11,000. I told her I'd think about it. She called back the next morning and told me, not asked, that she'd already told the caterer the balance was handled because you've never let us down before when it really counts, and this is the one time it really counts. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time after that call. 11 years of being introduced as the family disappointment, and the one time they needed actual money, $11,000 worth, they assumed the disappointment would simply pay it. I didn't send the money. I also didn't say no. I told my mother I needed a few days, which made her go quiet in a way that told me she hadn't planned for that answer. 4 days before the wedding, I drove to the depot myself, the way I do with every property in my portfolio before a major event, because that's just how I run my business. The walkthrough crew didn't recognize me out of context, in jeans and a baseball cap instead of the blazer I wear to lease signings, and I let that stand. I watched the wedding planner, a sharp woman named Greta, who I'd actually worked with twice on other events, without either of us connecting the dots, walk my mother through the final layout. I watched my mother point at a stack of folding chairs still wrapped in plastic by the loading dock and say, loud enough for 3 vendors to hear, "Someone needs to deal with that before Saturday. I'll see if Hannah can swing by, not ask, swing by." Like I was staff she was scheduling, I didn't correct her there. I wanted the room for that. The rehearsal dinner was at a steakhouse downtown, the kind with leather booths and a wine list nobody under 50 understands. That's where this started, where my mother introduced me as the older daughter who cleans, where my father added his line about expectations, where Derek's father, Walter Hargrove, looked at me like he was trying to place a face from a closing he'd done months earlier. I'd met him exactly once, briefly, at the signing for an office complex his firm co-developed, and my company now manages part of the grounds maintenance for. He hadn't placed me yet at dinner, not fully, but something in his memory was scratching at the door. When my mother finished her little introduction, the table did its usual polite, uncomfortable shuffle, the sound people make when they don't know whether to laugh or change the subject. Derek's mother, a woman named Eleanor, who ran her family's investment arm and had the kind of composure that comes from decades of boardrooms, looked at me with something closer to curiosity than pity. "What kind of cleaning work?" she asked, not unkindly. My mother answered for me before I could open my mouth. "Oh, residential mostly. Some light commercial. It's honest work." She said honest work the way you'd say it about someone who collects cans. I let it sit there for one more beat. Then Walter set down his glass and said the words that started everything. "Wait, aren't you the one who—" And I gave him the small shake of my head, "Not yet," and he stopped, and I watched him recalculate me in real time the way smart people do when a piece doesn't fit, and they're too disciplined to force it. The wedding day itself was where I'd decided, somewhere around that $11,000 phone call, that the quiet part of my life was going to end. Not with a scene. I don't do scenes. With facts delivered at the moment they'd land hardest. The depot looked beautiful that evening. Strings of lights through the exposed beams, the kind of venue that costs what it cost because someone finally fixed the roof and the HVAC in the parking lot, all of which, incidentally, had been on my company's punch list since February. I sat at a table near the back, not the head table, because nobody had thought to put me there, with a small card that said Hannah, sister of the bride in handwriting that wasn't mine, and a seating chart that put me between a sick cousin and an empty chair that was supposed to be Paige's old college roommate, who never showed. My mother found me during the cocktail hour, flushed with champagne and stress, and asked, in front of 2 of Eleanor's friends, whether I'd had a chance to handle that catering thing. I told her I had. She exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for a week and started to turn away. I asked her to wait. I told her the catering balance was paid, but not by me writing a personal check, and her face did this confused half-smile, waiting for the rest. I told her it was paid because the venue's management company had issued a credit against the final invoice, a standard adjustment for repeat clients in good standing, and that I knew this because I owned the management company. She laughed first, a short, nervous laugh, the kind people use when they think they've misheard. Then, she asked what I meant. I told her, plainly the way I'd tell a tenant about a lease clause. Larkfield Property Group has managed this property since February. I'm the founder and majority owner. The chairs by the loading dock you wanted me to move on. Wednesday, I own the dock. The cleaning company doing the maintenance, that's a subcontractor of mine. The $11,000 you told the caterer was handled, it's handled, but it came out of a corporate account, not a charity case. Eleanor, 4 feet away and clearly listening the entire time despite pretending not to, set down her glass. Walter walked over from the bar at exactly that moment, drawn by whatever shift in his wife's posture told him something was happening, and looked at me again longer this time, and then it landed. "Larkfield," he said slowly. "The Spring Valley office acquisition. You're Hannah Whitfield." It wasn't a question anymore. My mother's face did something I'd genuinely never seen it do before. It went white, then a kind of blotchy red, the specific color of someone realizing in real time that they've spent a decade introducing a multi-millionaire as the family failure in front of every person who might one day matter. She started to say something, some version of, "Well, you never told us," and I let her get about 4 words in before I said the only thing I'd actually planned to say all night. I told her I tried to tell her once 11 years ago about my education fund, and she told me I was being selfish. I said I learned my lesson that day about what this family does with information I hand them, and I'd simply stopped handing it over. Derek, to his credit, looked stricken, glancing between his new mother-in-law and his bride, with the expression of a man realizing his wedding had just become a different kind of event. Paige found us a minute later, drawn by the small gravitational pull of a scene forming, and when she heard the tail end of it, her first reaction wasn't shock, it was a flicker of something closer to calculation, like she was already running the math on what this meant for her, whether there was an angle in it. That told me everything about the furniture account I needed to know. I didn't raise my voice once. I want that on record, because the version of this story my mother tells now, when she tells it at all, makes me sound like I staged a public humiliation. I didn't. I answered a question. I stated facts in the order they were asked. The humiliation was entirely self-installed. I just stopped supplying the cover story. Eleanor was the one who actually changed the night. She walked over, introduced herself properly, and asked, with what sounded like genuine interest, how Larkfield had handled the depot's drainage issue, because her firm had looked at a similar property 2 years back and walked away over exactly that problem. We talked shop for 20 minutes while my mother stood frozen near the bar, untouched champagne sweating in her hand. Watching her older daughter, the cleaning lady, discussed commercial drainage easements with a woman whose family had more old money than my parents had ever pretended to. The wedding went on. I didn't ruin it, whatever the story going around the extended family might say. Paige and Derek got married, the toasts happened, the band played past midnight. I left around 11 before the cake, because I had an early flight for a closing in Austin, and because I'd gotten what I actually came for, not revenge exactly, just the simple, overdue experience of being seen accurately in a room my parents had spent a decade making sure I never was. My mother called 3 days later. She didn't apologize, not really, not in the shape an apology is supposed to take. She talked around it, said things like we had no idea and you could have just told us, as if the burden of correcting a decade of public condescension had been mine to carry instead of theirs to never create. I told her I loved her because despite everything I still do, in the complicated low-grade way you love people who raised you badly, and that I needed some distance for a while to figure out what kind of relationship, if any, made sense going forward, she cried. I let her. I didn't take it back. Paige texted a month later asking if I could maybe help her find a sales role at one of my properties, like nothing in that dining room had happened, like the furniture account had never existed. Like $11,000 hadn't almost left my account because she needed a wedding paid for in someone else's name. I didn't respond for a week. When I finally did, I told her I wasn't in a place to do that, and she hasn't asked again. My father, true to form, hasn't said much of anything. He sent one text, 2 weeks after the wedding, that just said proud of you, kiddo. 4 words for 11 years. And I haven't decided yet what to do with that, whether it's an opening or just one more performance for an audience he assumes is still watching. Walter Hargrove, of all people, has become an unlikely ally. His firm referred 2 new clients to Larkfield this spring, and at a follow-up lunch he told me, half joking, that he almost lost a development deal once because he misjudged a contractor's bid based on her appearance, and that the dinner where he watched my mother humiliate me taught him more about due diligence than any audit ever had. I told him that made one of us who learned something useful that night. I still own the depot. I still manage the property where my sister got married, where my mother once told a room full of strangers that I clean houses for a living, where I stood near the loading dock 4 days before the wedding and let a crew of vendors look right past me. Sometimes I drive out there for routine inspections, and I stand in that spot by the chairs, and I think about how long I let people believe the smallest version of me, and how much quieter it felt, in the end, to simply stop arguing and let the truth show up dressed the way it actually was.